Says they've ganged up with the Islamists. The Western elite have ganged up with the Islamists to push this narrative, which is also stemming from academia, who claim to have authority on India. Well, whether they do or not, or are they coming with a particular prism, we'll get into that. Dr. Makarand Paranjpe, Professor JNU, former director of the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, with us, joining us from Florida. Makarandji, namaste. Such a pleasure to have you on this show. It's been a long while, and I'm glad
to be on your show.
And I'm glad that it's happening. Vasik, writer and commentator and counter-extremist analyst, is also joining us from London. Vasikji, namaste. Thank you very much. Pleasure having you on the show. Sarah L. Gates, Dharmic Ecology, Hindu human rights activist, joining us from Australia. Sarahji, I apologize for keeping you up so late. I know it's late in the night, but it's very kind of you to have made the time and agreed to stay up and speak with us here on the show. And Dr. Vijayalakshmi Viswanathan is with us, author of Snakes in the Ganga, co-author with Rajiv Malhotra-ji. Vijayalakshmi-ji, you were very, very candid when I was there on the book launch, when you called out the academy about what they are propagating and what they are teaching. So,
Thank you so much for having me, Anand. Yeah.
So, let me start. Makarandji and Vijayalakshmi-ji, you're both joining us from Florida. I wonder what's happening there that the intelligentsia has gathered there. But let me ask you, Dr. Vijayalakshmi-ji, let me ask you first. Would you agree with Professor Babones when he says that this stems from a certain deep-rooted resentment, those who are offended by the rise of Bharat? This academia pushing this narrative.
Namaste, Anand. Yes, partly, but I would also blame the Indian elites and Indian educational institutions as well. So, for example, if you look at an up-and-coming, newly minted university like Kriya University in the south, which lacks total competence in Indian knowledge systems, but they have assembled Western academics to earn the credibility as an institution of eminence. Now, this does not come for free. This alliance with Western universities does not come for free. They have alliances with Yale University and MIT, and this doesn't come for free. So what does Kriya give back in return? Kriya gives back a whole lot of data on 200 Indian, just for one study, 200 Indian villages, data on their every family, 10,000 households. They have economic data on them. So that is given to Yale University, and this is in the repository of Yale's big data. Now, so that's one kind of payment. The second kind of payment is they promise to breed a new set of scholars and students on the Western ways of thinking. Now, this is not just limited to social science. Now, if you take economics, there's a Kriya University professor who has joined hands with a professor in Harvard University and Cornell to produce a paper on caste-based, how castes are segregated, and to show segregation based on caste. Now, Professor, there's nothing wrong with that. That is indeed an area that should be studied, fine. But these are so one-sided because Professor Viswanathan, who's a great scholar who knows jati-based, varna-based economic systems, has written extensively on this subject to show how caste networks are actually very beneficial to the success of certain communities. But this research, of course, is ignored. So you can easily see that it's a one-way street on this. And Professor Viswanathan is cancelled, is never included in any of this. There's another Kriya professor, he's just a master's in neuroscience or something, but he teaches writing in Kriya. And he says IIT, he talks about science education, and even science education is criticized like this. He says IIT is a hotbed of discrimination. IITs survive on casteism. IITs produce caste to continue the myth of merit. This is all from Kriya University. And then he also goes on to saying Ayurveda is inexorably linked to caste and casteism, and promoting Ayurveda equals promoting caste. Now, this is coming out of Kriya. So we have to question how our Indian billionaires who support Kriya University, and Kriya supports this kind of scholarship and in the name of freedom of academic expression, And this whole ecosystem, so we also have to take some blame. We can't just
Pass it off on
assign
the
all
West.
the blame to Western scholars and Western academics, because if we were rooted and grounded in our own Indic knowledge systems and we have a sense of self-worth, we wouldn't be doing this. So it's happening at an individual level. It's also happening at institutional level. The new
Right.
institutions we are building, unfortunately, are built like this, and that will scale up this whole thing even more.
But the academia or the that we are leaning on to add value and prestige and heft, and like you said, the give and take or the quid counter happens, the quid pro happens, is with a lot which is already leaning in particular way, or it's conditioned or thinking in a particular way. Saraji, one of the interesting things that Professor Babones told me when I spoke with him in September is that look at how they interpret data. 2010 to 2020, anybody who understands statistics does not make a decade. It makes 11 years. So you should look at it as 2010 to 2019 or 2011 to 2020. But these people in their research papers use the data point 2010 to 2020 because that's when the number fits the narrative, when they are trying to make a case of an index. But he also turns around and says that Freedom House, Economic Intelligence Unit or VDEM, they do not write these papers. They commission it to academia, who send them these reviews. And they send them a one-page review and a note, and they add it to this entire assessment. So where would you stand? Would you agree that there is a deep-rooted resentment? Why would somebody want to have an agenda against a nation they got nothing to do with?
Well, the agenda's it's very old. It goes back and it's just morphed. So you had colonialism, and then you had neo-colonialism, and you had all kinds of different geopolitical strategies in place. And one of those strategies was to fund scholarship. So you had American and British institutions funding scholarship, and they would guide that scholarship so that it was directed in a particular manner. And they would selectively decide what types of topics would be allowed to be studied and so forth. So this has been going on for generations. It's certainly nothing new. And I think that having studied the history of the word use of Indophobia, Hinduphobia and anti-Hindu sentiment, anti-Hindu legislation, there's around over 200 years of documented usage of these terms throughout the Western media and throughout the Indian media. And each one of those usages is a story in itself. So for every word use, you have to go and read, 10 or 20 other things to find out what context that's in. But there's been absolute vitriolic hatred, pitched against Hindus from so many different directions for such a long time, and I think it's very important not to blur it all together. So you need to know your perpetrators, you need to know your crimes, you need to know who's saying what about whom and when, and it's all very specific and it's all very complex. So I'm reluctant to say that anti-Hindu sentiment, Hindu hatred, Hinduphobia, which is actually a lot older than Islamophobia, it's 60 years older than Islamophobia. And it was coined by a Brit. So I'm reluctant to say it's any type of particular mentality. I think it's very dangerous to start saying it's fear or it's hatred or it's apathy or it's, it's resentment, because it is so diverse. When you look at the cases, if you do case studies on what is anti-Hindu hate crimes, anti-Hindu legislation, anti-Hindu policies, anti-Hindu narratives, anti-Hindu historic studies. I mean, this is just so far widely spread, and it's across every domain. It's in media, it's in academia, it's in think tanks, it's in government reports like what we've been talking about. And if you dig down into those references in these reports, some of them are absolutely absurd. And you've just got to wonder what type of academic standards these institutions are upholding. So what I found more recently is the internationalisation attempts of political lobbyists, particularly those concerned with Palestine, Kashmir, the CIA plus NRC, the farmers' issues. And then, of course, you've got issues of Islamism. Khalistan was connected to some of those protests, and you've got, you know, major unrest that's been connected to these policies.